Good afternoon and welcome to this, the third in our series of 5 sessions. Today we're going to look at how to monitor and review risk. And a little bit about us. We'll always put this in at the beginning. I think everybody at this stage knows about us. You'll get the slide deck anyway. So if anybody wants to contact us, they know where we are. So third in the series is how to monitor and review risk. And there's a fit, and sometimes there's a bit of an overlap. But in today's sessions, if you look down the bottom here, what we're looking to do is talk a little bit about the effective use of the risk register and how the risk register informs the monitoring of the key controls. And we're talking about two things here with the review process. So you've got the existing key controls, you've got the existing mitigants, and you're monitoring those to make sure that they are and remain effective. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're using the output data from the monitors to review the risks when they're talking about existing control. But do bear in mind that there are the other potential mitigation controls that you could put in to improve the residual position of the risk or reduce the risk, the likelihood of the consequence. And in so doing, the process of review is almost, I wouldn't say it's automatic, but it's part of what you're doing when you do that, add additional controls. So we're using the risk register as the source of truth here. And as a result, we can get a look in the review process at, first of all, the presence, and secondly, the effectiveness of the controls. And that's probably key to what we're trying to achieve here. So the risk register, a couple of things: relevant risk categorizations, and make sure your risks are in the right place and they're categorized, that the categorization makes sense. And you're looking here always at a carefully considered set of risk criteria. And these risk criteria change, or they can change. A circumstance changes, the objectives change. So it's worth doing a criteria review when you do an update of a strategic plan, or you change any of the objectives. The criteria tend to reflect, or should reflect, the objectives, looking at basically what's lost and the extent to which the consequence and the likelihood might occur, and when it begins to become an issue in terms of the calculation of the residual risk. And that really, the mathematics of that is done just to put the risks in a context. So what are the things you should be worked and worried about, and what are the things that are not of immediate concern? And that turns up in the sorting of the residual value in the risk register. The categorization is important there because you may want to sort those risk registers by category. And it's important to be able to filter that and have a look at, okay, where are we doing with compliance? Where are we doing with GDPR? Where are we doing with the business objectives or the cybersecurity or whatever? And that categorization it's not critical, but it's useful. And basically the residual value determined, as I said last time, with the key controls. What are the key controls and what are the additional mitigation options? And in the review, you'll be looking at those for confirmation of their effectiveness, but also for the potential at any given time to add additional mitigation options. So first of all, then, is the monitoring. And it's important to monitor. Monitoring is about continuously checking. It's continuously checking the environment in which you operate, and the consideration of sort of all the variables. What you're trying to do is reduce the likelihood or frequency of any loss. The consequence, reducing the consequence or impact, that would be the severity of the loss. And then some mitigants will reduce a combination of both. In training, we would often look at a fire alarm in a building. A fire alarm won't do anything to prevent a risk, but it will considerably reduce the consequence. bring the fire brigade on early, make sure everybody's out of the building, that kind of thing. So there are other things then that will reduce the consequence, like the sprinkler system. So same building, put a sprinkler system into it, reduces the consequence because there's less damage. So there's before and after, but there's also ones that that will impact both. And the controls, I mentioned here a thing called the all and always test. And the all and always test is if you've got a control in place. One of the most dangerous things, I suppose, in risk is to have a control that's in place that's ineffective, because you think you have the control in place, but it's not working. And the issue with the all and always thing is, if your control is critical, it needs to work all the time, and it needs to buy and implement it. If it's a process control that people are involved in, implement it all the time and by everybody. So that's all and always. And that control, that thought process around the control informs the monitoring. So if it's something that has to pass the all and always test, if it doesn't, then you're at real risk. Obviously, they're the ones that you begin to put some kind of monitoring into. And the monitoring is about the confirmation that the control is in place, the confirmation that the control is working. And it's about checking back to make sure that it's always working and all of the people are following the process or procedure that is associated with the control. I put the note in here, never be afraid to add gaps, because we call them generally mitigation options. There are additional mitigation options. And if you remember last time we spoke, we talked about the resources, because when you identify a gap, some people, when they're dealing with particularly compliance risk, they tend to want to hide the gaps. They want to say they have no gaps. You're better off in risk management terms to identify the gap, make a resource decision, say, I don't have the resources to do that today. I put it on a plan for sometime in the future, but identify it and put it into the register. It's an additional mitigation option. If I want to reduce this risk further, I put it in here. And when you're doing a review, always look to see if now would be the time to apply some of the resource to put in the additional mitigation option, or put it into a plan, or decide to continue to tolerate the additional mitigation option as such. The risk mitigation plan we talked about the last time, and that, again, the monitoring informs the actions in the mitigation plan, obviously parallel and combined with the resource. I put this in here for just to get a thought into your heads. If you look at the first one here, for the want of a nail, probably some of you will be familiar with the poem. It supposedly came from the Battle of Bosworth, where King Richard III led a charge, a cavalry charge, and partway through it, his horse lost a shoe. And as a result, Richard was killed and the battle was lost. This was in the War of the Roses. But in any event, the idea is that when people talk about risk and they talk about controls, there's a series of linked processes often associated with the achievement of objectives. Somebody wants to do something, and sometimes for that to happen, there's a single process sometimes, or a series of processes. And one of those processes, if one of those processes fails, then the consequence can amplify. And that's really the thought that I want to put to you here. Sometimes when you're in the risk and compliance management business, people always say, oh, you have too many risks. The reality is, what you have is an awful lot of controls. Sometimes you gather them together and put a risk title on them. So a failure to do something like manage anti-money laundering. But inside that, there's a series of continuous connected processes. And if one of those connections fails, or one of those processes fails, then you can amplify the context of the consequence of that. It's the famous domino effect. I put two others up here. Again, some of you will remember the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico with BP. The cost to mitigate there is currently, and it's still going on, the cost to mitigate is over $30 billion of that. And if you look at the note, it's just a bad cement job at the beginning of the process. It was a process. The cement job was one of 11 processes that were sequential, and the first failure amplified by the next process failure, amplified by the next one, and so on until they got to the stage they got at. The third example is just another one that it's one of these things that has become something that turns up in the study of these things. This is a comment here from the FCA in the UK. Rayfields was an old family-run bank of long and very good reputation, long-standing, and they wound up wandering, and I describe it as wandering, into the business of payment cards. And they didn't have enough experience, they didn't know what they were doing, and basically the thing failed on the afternoon of a Christmas Eve in 2015, and by reputation, by their inability to respond, by the lack of customer support, by simply not knowing what was going on, the bank eventually was damaged to the point of collapse, was fined, was reputationally hosed, and eventually was taken over by a larger bank and is still there in name, but only in name. So that's the amplified consequence of a small thing. So it's important to consider the monitoring of the small thing. I can't monitor everything, but you can monitor those key controls. So in any risk conversation, and when you talk about monitoring, you have to talk about compliance as part of a risk, or as a risk in itself. And much of the risk management in organizations is around compliance risk set. So inside the compliance regime, there are processes, same as the oil rigs or whatever it is, there are processes, and the processes have controls, and each control can fail. And if any of the key controls fails in the compliance risk, it tends to be an opportunity for non-compliance or non-compliance exposure. And some of the processes have both business and compliance aspects. So they're built into one another, if you know what I mean. So achieving certain business objectives will have some compliance requirements in it. So, for example, making the sale of a stock, which is transfer of undertaking, in that completion process, there are compliance rules associated with it, but there's also the achievement of the business objective, which is to make the trade and earn a commission. So they're connected, if you like. Some processes have, by association, compliance requirements. Very similar in the Consumer Protection Code, in advertising, if you like. Call them the rules of the game. And really, that's what they are. They're there for the protection, societal protection, both international and national and international. So you know all the local ones, and then you have the big ones like the GDPR one, the Homeland Security would have driven the counterterrorism finance and the anti-money laundering, all that compliance. You also have the usual national one, which would be your tax compliance. And in the compliance risk, in the risk set here, I call it a risk set, there's two things. First of all, there's a credible threat of enforcement, and a lot of people will query the enforcement, and organizations tend to, I don't say resent the compliance issue, but it's a burden. And one of the things that's very important from the regulator's perspective, the regulatory perspective, is if they're going to enforce, that it's evenly enforced. Smaller companies, smaller organizations would say the burden is way too heavy. But the reality is the regulators are inclined to say, well, an individual impacted by the lack of compliance by a large organization is exactly the same as an individual impacted by the actions or inactions of a small organization. Therefore, the regulation applies across the board. Biggest issue with the compliance risk is the cost to remedy. And so from a monitoring and review perspective, the thing to do is when you've identified a failure or a process weakness, you got to fix it, and fix it, or at least have a plan to fix it. The realization of the consequence with a compliance thing is slower. But nonetheless, once you start that process chain we talked about earlier on, it can be a slow burn. But if you're not fixing some of the process steps and mitigating and repairing whatever process failure has caused the issue in the first place, then the consequences grow, because the regulator, if they come to find the organization or do an investigation, then because you haven't acted, you haven't been seen to act, they amplify the fines, they amplify the reputation damage, and obviously the thing escalates in the media as well. So act on the outcomes of the monitoring in the compliance risks as well, although you might hate to do them. So this is just a graphic that illustrates the guy, Paul McNulty. This was probably round about the SOX, the time of that implication, and his note: if you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. I don't think there's any more to be said here. So risk review. When do we do the risk review? Well, a couple of ways and a couple of inputs. So first of all, it's time bound. So when I say it's time bound, use a time-bound risk review, so scheduled. Some of these will be mandated or strongly suggested in the regulation. Sometimes they're looking for a policy review on an annual basis. If you're doing a policy review, you might as well have a look at the risk as well. Some of them would be less onerous than that. Some of them would be 3 years. So yeah, have a schedule that says we're going to review. And again, back to the categorization, it's awfully useful if you've got some expertise in a certain category of risk management, like your IT stuff, for example. Have a time-bound scheduled. We're going to review that. Second item there, for example, is to achieve a standard or maintain a standard. A lot of people who would be audited against a standard would check and review the risks ahead of that audit. And if they're trying to achieve a standard, then they will do a risk-based approach to compliance with that standard. And in that sense, that they are then doing the risk assessment first of all, and prompted before any audit to do a review. Responding to a newly identified mitigation, there's changes happening all the time. People are finding solutions, particularly we notice in the cybersecurity space, people are finding solutions to some of the attack vectors. And if you've got something like response to a newly identified mitigation may well be a patch on a system, but it can be anything. So if there's a new change in a regulatory environment, for example, or if somebody has identified a way to do something better, be aware of it and apply it. Ad hoc reviews are something that can be triggered by a change in a risk context, for example, the internal or external risk context. So something has changed in the business. You might have lost a customer, you might have added a new product. There may be something in the wider world, like, for example, a supply chain shortage that might have caused you to have increased risk. And you begin to look at your situation again, that triggers a review. Feedbacks from monitoring. So whatever the stuff that you're checking is telling you, you put your finger on the pulse, and if the pulse starts to quicken, you say, I need to do something, and look at why that's happening. That will trigger review. External risk events. And this is a little bit like learning from the world. So stuff will happen. Sometimes it happens to competitors, sometimes it happens to people who are in the same sector. Tune into it and have a quick review to see if you could be exposed to the same event that has caused them grief. And then sometimes when you're talking about bodies, organizations that are sectoral, looking after it, keep reading their outputs, because they will also be identifying and sharing risk relevant to the sector. Escalated complaints, this is the stuff that comes from the incidents, the monitoring, the regular monitoring. Escalated complaints is an indicator we're triggering a review, incidents, audit findings, near misses. Response to oversight questions. I put this in there because an awful lot of time when you're reporting risk and compliance issues to oversight, to a board of directors or senior management team, you'll get questions, and the questions might trigger a review, because you might just say, "Oh, I haven't checked that in a while," or "I don't know," or "I don't know, I'll come back to you." That kind of thing. Trigger a review of the risk, have a quick look, see how you're fixed, and if there's something in there, report it backwards. But again, it's just a reason to review. Takeaways, and I'm conscious of the time. It's a holistic, continuous process. Monitor and review, it's part of what you do. Planet come from, you're looking, it's like an audit schedule. Put it down and say, right, I'm going to do this. This is going to be done by the organization with some regularity. You can determine the frequency. Some of them, no doubt, some of the risks that you'll have in your register are less important than others, and you can schedule that or reflect that in a schedule. Do it on a monthly, quarterly, yearly, or 3-yearly basis, whatever it is. I would be inclined to say most risks should be touched for examination in a 3-year period. Again, depends on the organization, but you do have a look. Remember that the ones that are frequently, the ones that are in the eye, the ones that impact the key objectives, they're frequently monitored by virtue of the fact that there are eyes on them all the time in the organization. So you walk through the organization, you'll see things up on the board about loan rates, about ratios, about that kind of stuff. That monitoring is happening, and they may trigger a special review of the risk. But when the monitoring is visible, those things have the eye. They're being monitored frequently. They're probably quarterly, monthly, anything that's reported up. Gather and analyze the useful data. Very important to pick up stuff. So customer complaints, things like attrition rates, all sorts of things. Why are people leaving? That kind of thing. Very useful to gather and do a review. Check it, see if there's anything you can do about it. There may not be. Recording feedback. Now, recording the feedback on the results of your monitoring is important, because it's an indication that you're on top of, albeit a change, and it may be something that you can't impact. For example, you've got a supply chain issue and suddenly you can't make product. Yeah, it's maybe something you can't impact, but record and be on top of it. And then we say implement the action plan. So when you've agreed that you're going to do something, just don't make it shelfware. Do it. Run the plan, finish the tasks, get the stuff done. Don't overload the plate. Don't take on too much that's beyond your resource, because what happens is people get frustrated with the fact that it's not happening, or it's late and the rest of it. So have a schedule, meet the schedule. If you've got spare time, do some additional or pull the schedule forward. But don't put so much on the plate that you can't actually manage with the resource you have. And then I put in the word rinse and repeat, and the rinse and repeat is basically, yeah, it's a continuous cycle. Do it again, plan, do, check, act, do it again, do it again, do it again. Keep using the data you gather. I'm done. Fiona, have we any questions?
Hi, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm good.
There's a question come in from James. James just wants to know, can we have a demonstration of the risk management functionality of the system? So I suppose how this works in practice.
Right, okay. Well, I appreciate now that I'm over time, but normally with these, we don't talk about our system, and we don't use it in marketing. But I tell you, if there's an interest in a demo of how this process works, I'd happily put one together. I put it in as an extra insert in the series, and send out an invitation to it in the next couple of weeks. But anybody who wants an individual demo can come on our website or send me an email, and we'll organize that. No problem.
Okay, and yeah, Carol has just seconded that. She'd like a demo, please. She'd definitely be up for that. So, and some thanks coming in from Denise and some others. So thanks, Paul, for that.
Okay. Well, apologies for taking too long. I probably rabbited on a little bit. I went beyond my time, but
Well, Denise said you were very informative and to the point, so, take it, take it.
I took on too much maybe this week.
All
Anyway,
right.
okay, listen, look forward to the next one, and thank you very much for your time, and I hope you got something from it. And as usual, the notes and the slide deck will be circulated later, and it's available recording on our YouTube channel somewhere out there.